Hello, valued viewers. I hope you're all doing very well. This video is about the forgotten Mallet, the 2442 Skookum. Enjoy. So folks, I'll start off the video by saying this is one locomotive type that I know wholeheartedly about simply because I watched the restoration of it right across the street from my office at the Oregon Coast Scenic Railroad. And the sign that you see above is a sign that I actually designed for the Oregon Coast Scenic Railroad that's on display at roadside for their Garibaldi, Oregon shops. And while I did not take part in the restoration of the 2442 Skookum, I did watch its restoration progress as time went on. And I also, as you now know, have an indirect business relationship with the Oregon Coast Scenic Railroad, who rebuilt the locomotive. So the first thing I'll note about the 2442 Skookum is the way it was found, which is entirely in pieces and on its side off a set of tracks. And I got to tell you, watching the sheer progression of the restoration of this locomotive was sheer joy. And many would have thought that it was a feat that's basically impossible to accomplish. You know, that given the state that the locomotive was found in. So the number 7 Skookum, which was formerly... So needless to say, this 2442 wheel arrangement was extremely rare. And to be precise about that, only 3 were built by Baldwin. And only one of those 3 survived today, which is the former Little River number 126, which is now, today, the number 7 Skookum. So as I mentioned, the restoration of the Skookum took place in the Oregon Coast Scenic Railroad in Garibaldi, Oregon, and it took 15 years to rebuild this locomotive. And that restoration concluded in January 2023. And as of right now, the locomotive is located at the Niles Canyon Railway in Alameda County, California. So in 1909, the Baldwin Locomotive Works of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania received an order from Tennessee's Little River Railroad to construct a Mallet locomotive. The Little River Railroad's president, Colonel W.B. Townsend, wanted his company to experiment with a locomotive that would not be light enough to negotiate lightweight rails and tight curves while being powerful enough to pull longer trains than an average steam engine of the time. Baldwin subsequently came out with the first Mallet they would ever build for a logging company, which is the number 7, rolled out of the factory in June of 1909. Originally carrying the number of 126, and it was without a name. It was a one-off design having carried the unusual 2442 wheel configuration, and it was capable of negotiating a 160-foot radius curve. It was originally ordered and built as a coal burner, but it was converted to burn oil very shortly after delivery. After the 126 was delivered, the Little River Railroad used it for some trial runs on their trackage. In the process, the locomotive derailed on curves multiple times, and it was discovered that the number 126 was too heavy for the lightweight rails. Unsatisfied with its weight, the railroad sent the engine back to Baldwin less than 1 month later after its delivery. Baldwin subsequently built a smaller 2442, this time the number 148 for the Little River Railroad's needs, and they offered number 126 for sale to other companies. After sitting in Baldwin's factory yard for a short while, number 126 was purchased in June of 1910 by Whitney Logging Company of Blind Slough, Oregon. The locomotive was soon delivered to Blind Slough, where the company, whose practice was to give their engine names instead of numbers, removed the number 126 and added the name Skookum, whereas Skookum is a Chinook term meaning strong, powerful, and reliable. And then the Whitney Logging Company assigned Skookum to work its rails subsidiary to Columbia River Beltline Railway. Skookum quickly exceeded all expectations over its performance as it successfully pulled trains without any problems. One factor to this might have been the CRBL's trackage having more support for the engine compared to the Little River's trackage. During 1911, Skookum's success was covered in several local newspapers. The positive press led to Baldwin receiving additional orders to build nearly 50 other Mallet engines for other logging companies within the coming years. Skookum continued to faithfully serve the CRBL until 1920, when it was sold to the Larkin Green Lumber Company, who was also in Blind Slough. And that logging company quickly sold the engine to the Carlisle Pennell Lumber Company of Onalaska, Washington, who removed the name Skookum and added the number 7 before it was placed into service there. During its time there, the locomotive was rebuilt with additional handrails on the pilot deck, and the air pump was relocated to the front of the smoke box door. Beginning in 1924, number 7 was transferred to the Carlisle Penal subsidiary, the Newaukum Valley Railroad, from 1930 to 1931 at the start of the Great Depression. Number 7 was leased to the Mud Bay Logging Company to pull lumber trains between Mud Bay and Olympia. After the lease, the engine was moved back to Carlisle Penal's property, but by 1933, the company had cleared out all of their timberlands. With number 7 no longer needed in Onalaska, it was sold again to the Deep River Logging Company of Deep River, Washington. So in the early 1950s, the DRL company began to consider discontinuing their rail operations due to the decrease in traffic, and they subsequently decided to have all of their remaining locomotives scrapped and the remaining rails ripped up by the end of 1955. On the afternoon of February 23, 1955, number 7 was moving in reverse with a string of empty freight cars to pick up a heavy load. However, when it reached a small trestle near Grays Harbor, its tender hit a broken piece of rail, making it derail and hang halfway on the trestle, and the entire engine precariously leaned towards one side. The crews dropped the fire, came off, and examined the situation, and they felt the Mallet seemed stable enough to remain still, so they left it and waited until the next morning to re-rail it, using the company's Alco 262 Prairie engine. So on that fateful day, the firemen also chose to keep the crown sheet covered with water overnight so the engine would be ready for service the very next day. But as water was injected into the boiler, it affected the center of gravity for the locomotive. And when crews came back for the number 7, the center of gravity gave out and the locomotive completely toppled onto its side off of the short trestle. And despite the locomotive receiving minimum damage from hitting the soft ground in a muddy creek bed, the crews saw no easy way to move it upright out of the rails. With the DRL company only having a few months left of operating time, and with the Alco 262 Prairie still operable, it was decided to simply abandon the number 7 right there and where it sat. When scrapping commenced on the company's remaining fleet, the scrappers opted not to torch number 7 because it was way too inconvenient to get the remains out of the remote area where the Mallet sat. So in 1956, railroad fan Charlie Morrow became aware of the number 7's abandoned status in the woods. He had known about Skookum's fame for its innovative design for years, and he decided to contact the scrappers with the possibility of buying it. He successfully managed to purchase the Mallet for its scrap value of $1,200. Morrow subsequently co-founded the group alongside other railroad fans called the Puget Sound Railway Historical Association, in dedication of bringing number 7 Skookum back under steam. In the summer of 1960, the process of moving the locomotive out of the woods began, but since the rails had been ripped up for years prior, and with the roadways not being located close by, Morrow and his fellow PSRHA members had to disassemble number 7 and move it in sections. Number 7's boiler and frame have been attached to each other since 1909 construction date, and the PSRHA members struggled to have them separated with the rusty bolts locking them together. And as a last resort, they decided to blast them apart using dynamite, and at that point, the boiler and frame were finally separated. And for reasons unknown, the PHRHA's plans to restore and run the number 7 Skookum had fallen through, and the Mallet instead sat disassembled in the PARHA's Niblock yard for the next few decades with little activity done on it. In 1978, Morrow passed away, and number 7 fell under ownership of an estate company who in turn sold it to a California-based logger, Rohan Coombs. Coombs kept number 7 in Snoqualmie, Washington, while he explored options for the Mallet's future. In 1996, Coombs had the pieces relocated to the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad in Mineral, Washington. The plan was to have the locomotive restored and eventually ran out of Mount Rainier's trackage, but this also fell through. So in 2004, Coombs began experiencing failing health, and he contacted another railroad fan, Chris Baldwin, about purchasing the engine before his passing. Baldo agreed to purchase the number 7 Skookum, and with the help of young rail apprentice Scott Wickard, number 7's frame and running gear were moved to the recently established Oregon Coast Scenic Railroad in Garibaldi, Oregon for repairs. The boiler and tender were moved to Chehalis, Washington to undergo an extensive rebuilding process. Baldo also used an exact replica of number 7's original wooden cab made from scratch. During the restoration, it was decided to revert the engine to its CRBL livery with its Skookum name, but also having it retain its road number 7. Years later, on December 15, 2014, the rebuilt boiler was moved to Garibaldi by truck, and the next day it was lifted and reunited with the frame. The tender was also moved to the Oregon Coast Engine House in Tillamook for temporary storage. And finally, on March 2nd, 2019, Skookum made its first official public run, and several years' restoration work on the engine was finally completed. Some days later, the engine participated in 2 public photo charters that were sponsored by Trains Magazine, and McLeod 25 and Postal Logging number 2 also took part. In April, number 7 steamed to Tillamook, its last operation in Oregon soil. The engine and tender were subsequently loaded into a separate heavy-haul trucks and transported south to Niles Canyon Railway. After arriving at the NCRY's location in Sonoma, California, number 7 spent the entirety of the 2019 summer months pulling excursion trains on the NCRY's trackage alongside their other locomotives. And since that time, the number 7 Skookum has been running excursion runs occasionally, but currently the number 7 remains at the NCRY's location, but is unknown whether it will remain there or be moved to another railroad location. And with that, the following specifications apply to the 2442 Skookum locomotive as completed its rebuild in 2018. The main drivers were 48 inches. The adhesive weight of the locomotive was 129,850 pounds. The locomotive weight was 162,650 pounds. The tender weight was 80,350 pounds for a total combined weight of 243,000 pounds even. It burned coal and then later fuel oil. Fuel capacity was 1,500 U.S. gallons. The water capacity was 4,000 U.S. gallons. The firebox grade area was 28.30 square feet. The boiler pressure was 200 psi. It had 4 cylinders, 2 high cylinder engines at 15 inches by 22 inches, and 2 low pressure cylinders at 23 inches by 22 inches. It used Walschaerts valve gears. The tractive effort was 24,600 pounds, and the factor of adhesion was an outstanding 5.28. And with that, I shall wrap up the video. And if you enjoyed the content today, please hit the like button. And also, if you've not subscribed, please hit the subscribe button, as both features help the channel grow immensely. And don't forget about the Super Thanks feature on the taskbar if you want to contribute to the channel's efforts. Any donation is greatly appreciated. And once again, we thank you very much.